Today, we are standing here in front of the Horse Fair, painted by Rosa Bonheur in 1855. The scene shows horses being paraded by their handlers through a market in Paris. This is the central subject of the painting, or so it seems. We might not necessarily associate this painting with the genre of the self-portrait, but if we zoom in to the centre of the painting, we can see this figure gazing out at us, the viewer. It has been widely accepted for some time that this is a self-portrait of Rosa Bonheur. Today we're going to talk about why Rosa Bonheur might have put herself in this painting and what that suggests about her experience as a woman and an artist in 19th century France. Amy, let's talk about who Rosa Bonheur was.
Rosa Bonheur was a woman living in the late 19th century. She was born into a family in which the father was not an especially well-known artist, shall we say, who had a school in which he taught drawing. Rosa, therefore, was trained by her father. In fact, all three of Rosa's siblings were also trained by her father. Rosa was especially drawn to the representation of animals.
We can't avoid the fact that animals were accessible subjects to Rosa Bonheur because she didn't have access to life drawing classes, for instance, which excluded her from all manner of genres of painting.
When it came to the academies, these didn't open up to women until quite late in the 19th century, so quite late in Rosa Bonheur's life.
This is a copy of an original, one that was 4 times the size. It's now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And when that was exhibited in 1853 at the Paris Salon, it caused a sensation. This is the painting that turned Rosa Bonheur into an international celebrity.
It's not to say that she hadn't been successful prior to this painting. She won a first-class medal in 1848. But you're absolutely right. This is the painting that really ensures that she has gained a kind of international acclaim.
It was so successful, so well known, that this copy was created to facilitate the creation of prints. It kind of indicates just how prolific this image was. When the original painting was exhibited at the Paris Salon, people couldn't believe that this was a painting by a woman, which in itself is indicative of this binary between male and female artists and how Rosa Bonheur comes in to upset that binary.
A great quote from one of the critics at the time. He says something along the lines of, Rosa Bonheur paints almost like a man. I'm thinking now of a well-known fact that people immediately sort of associate with this painting itself. She needed a police certificate to gain permission to wear masculine attire to visit these horse markets. And we know that this horse fair, a very specific horse fair in the southeastern part of central Paris, was a horse fair that she visited at least twice a week for a year and a half, making sketches of the horses for the painting itself. So wearing trousers, wearing boots is something that enabled her to visit these otherwise kind of masculine spaces, really.
And this was something that was done every 6 months. This wasn't something that you applied for and you had it for life.
Her doctor had to countersign it as well.
So it's really the state kind of trying to control any people who might deviate from the norm. And that brings us really back to this figure in the centre, which is seen as a self-portrait for several reasons. One, because of the shorter hair that flicks out from the visored cap. Another reason is because the figure faces us at a 3/4 view, which is typical for an artist's self-portrait looking in a mirror. And then the final reason is that it actually resembles Rosa Bonheur. This is something that wasn't known in her lifetime or perceived in her lifetime. If this is the case, that it's a self-portrait in the centre of this painting, it has been quite secretive. It's been hidden in plain sight for generations.
I think it's also notable that she is this figure of calm in what is otherwise a kind of chaos of horses' bodies and human bodies. And she seems to have a real reserve about her that distinguishes her from almost any other figure. I think it's also notable, of course, that she is riding astride. So whilst gender norms of the time would have dictated that women ride side saddle, she is very obviously riding astride the horse, which was something that would have in and of itself been seen as subversive. Rosa Bonheur is really representing herself in this scene unencumbered. She isn't wearing this really restrictive female dress. She's wearing this blue smock, very much like the artist's smock that she would wear later in life in some of the portraits that we have of her standing at an easel. She is also representing herself amongst horses that have yet to be sold. Horses who are conveying this sense of freedom and energy and agency in a way that she has really located herself in the middle of.
I think that this idea of freedom and the freedom of movement is incredibly important here, because we see that in this idea of the female horse rider, but also in her being able to access the horse market by dressing in male clothing. In paintings by artists such as Landseer, we see a much more domestic, much more sentimentalized image of women and horses as things to be dominated, in a sense, as things to have power over. What this really shows is this connection that was being made between women's bodies and the bodies of horses as well. When the original was shown at the Paris Salon in 1853, it is said that Napoleon III whipped the painting next to it, which was Gustave Courbet's The Bathers, and accounts vary, but it is said that he also asked if that was a Percheron too, which we see here in the painting. He had compared the body of the horse to the body of the woman. In the painting itself, there's a really fascinating comparison we can make between her three-quarter length view at us and the horse to her left, who also mirrors that pose and looks at us, the viewer, as well. And the horse, of course, is one of the most untamable horses in the scene.
It's interesting to think about this figure of the woman riding a horse in Paris as a figure that in some way felt somewhat threatening to people, I think, in terms of their own modernity. And I'm thinking of the cartoon from 1859 by John Leech. It was published in the satirical magazine Punch's Almanac. And in that cartoon, you can see a group of women horse riders standing there gesturing towards a man who is playing with a small child. And they seem to be demonstrating how they have broken this man in the same way that one might break a horse, that the man has been domesticated, shall we say, and there's an entire crowd of women looking down, watching this scene.
It's breaking this apparent boundary that is between public and private, between the spaces that belong to women, the domestic realm, and the public spaces of man. And Rosa Bonheur herself is kind of doing that in her own domestic setup, and actually introducing an idea that she is the man of the house in many ways, and that her wife, in a sense, an unofficial wife, Nathalie Micas, is the one who takes care of the domestic matters.
The two women met when they were very young girls, and this becomes a friendship and a relationship that really kind of takes off. We now really interpret Rosa Bonheur to have been aligning herself with what we might now regard as kind of queer identity. In fact, Lady Eastlake, who was the wife of the then director of the National Gallery, Charles Eastlake, she writes in her diary about meeting Rosa Bonheur and actually makes a comment where she says, Rosa Bonheur is neither English or French. And I wondered if that might connect in some ways to this very delicate balance that Rosa Bonheur struck between the masculine and the feminine, at least in the way in which those terms would have been defined in the 19th century.
In that same journal written by Lady Eastlake, she actually describes Rosa Bonheur in gendered terms. She says she's a woman to meet, but in her art, she is male. So here we are looking at, this idea that her work is perceived as masculine, but that as herself, as a person, as an artist, as a woman, she is defying fixed gendered terms.
I think that there is a tension between, on the one hand, the rather traditional aesthetic that she's using and her rather unorthodox lifestyle. And I think this is still something that's being unpicked.
But also, it's incredibly radical in a sense, because many scholars have seen this painting as an expression of Rosa Bonheur's proto-lesbian identity. And by that we mean an identity that at this point had no visual or verbal language to express itself.
Through a process of erasure and omission, we find ourselves in a position where I wouldn't be at all surprised if many people experiencing this painting in the galleries have never heard of Rosa Bonheur. And it's well known that by the mid-20th century, there was really a widespread omission of women artists from many kind of standard histories of Western European painting. Now, you and I have discussed this term, woman artist. It, at best, implies a kind of categorical difference between artists who are men and artists who are women, and at worst, sort of implies that the work of women artists is somehow lesser or inferior. In a really foundational text for what was to become known as feminist art history, Linda Naucklin's 1971 essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Linda Naucklin chooses Rosa Bonheur as her case study at the end of that essay, and one of the reasons that she chooses her is because she describes her as one of the most successful and accomplished women artists of all time. I would go a step beyond that and say that she was really the single best known and most successful artist who was also a woman in the 19th century.
We can actually see her as quite a radical artist of her time. She is someone who is self-determined. She is someone who is in control, and this painting really speaks to that kind of important and empowering legacy.
Exactly. It's the way in which she navigated those barriers and the strategies that she used to overcome them that really kind of puts her on the map for us today.
If you'd like to learn more about art history, then click here
or here
and subscribe to our channel.
Thank you for joining us today.